This is the Eaton's Carcano. It's a hunting rifle sporterized by one of Canada's greatest firearm manufacturers, Cooey, for one of Canada's greatest department stores, Eaton's. Both of these names are relics of a long bygone era, which makes this rifle somewhat of a time capsule to the modern world. Today, we don't sporterize battle rifles, we preserve them. Today, we also don't go to department stores or use snail mail as much. But enough boomerish lamentation. Give us the thesis, I can hear you type furiously. I'm getting there, just a little more history. I received this rifle from a person who was clearing out their collection. He wanted a bottle of rum for it, a steal of a deal for a hunting rifle in fairly good condition. I obliged him, and $26 later, I was the proud owner of this oddity. Wanting to know more about it, I did some research and bought one of the only sources for Cooey guns and their history. The entry on the Cooey Eaton's Carcano, well, it isn't exactly flattering. Serious accidents, death, litigation, recalls, weak actioned, don't shoot. What the hell is going on here? Well, I'm gonna tell you what's going on here based on all the evidence I found, and let you come to the conclusion yourself on whether or not this rifle is safe or a death trap. Hopefully, I can convince you that not only is this rifle an excellent shooter, but it's safe, reliable, and most likely, turns out it's not a Cooey at all. Let's dive into the Eaton's Carcano. To anyone who grew up after 1999, Eaton's was Canada's version of Sears, or perhaps to be less outdated, Canada's Walmart. Eaton's had everything. Baby clothes to bolt actions, bobsleds to baking trays, basswood canoes to boxing gloves, all at the touch of your fingers in a convenient mail order catalog. You could get a house delivered to your property by the very draft horses that you would use to plow your farm. It was a one-stop shop for everything, and their position allowed them to dominate the Canadian retail market for over 100 years, beating out the much more ancient Hudson's Bay Company and the plucky newcomer Canadian Tire. That was, until one day they just up and vanished. But this isn't an Eaton's retrospective, no, that's for another time. This video is questioning why, in the middle of die-hard Winchester and Lee Enfield rifle country, would Eaton's need to import an Austrian-captured Italian rifle from World War I that was rebarreled to a fairly unpopular Greek caliber. This started life as an M91 Carcano rifle. Here's what it's supposed to look like. It was Italy's main infantry workhorse and was used from the highest peak of the Alps to the deepest depression in the Libyan desert. The Eaton's rifles are all World War I vintage, as they were offered by the catalogue from 1929 to 1931. But all of their markings have been milled off, so their true age is hard to pinpoint. In World War I, Italy would come up against the Austro-Hungarian Empire as its main enemy, fighting 12 rounds at the banks of the Isonzo River, falling back to the Piave River after their defeated Caporetto, and then finishing off the Austro-Hungarians after winning the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The defeated Caporetto not only led to a lot of casualties, but also the capture of a ton of equipment. The Austro-Hungarians were filled to the brim with Italian field guns, mortars, grenades, and most importantly, rifles. Those rifles were a different caliber to the Austrian main battle rifle, so they were as good as useless until they could get a steady supply of 6.5 by 52 Carcano ammunition. In the meantime, to keep them from getting recaptured, the Austrians most likely shipped the Italian equipment back to the heartland of the empire. This is probably where the rifle lived for a few years, in some dingy old Viennese warehouse covered in cosmoline, or whatever the World War I equivalent of preservative grease is. After the war, the Treaty of Trianon split up the Austro-Hungarians into their requisite cultural parts and disarmed the losing nations. And while they couldn't arm their military, they could export their surplus to pay off war reparations. This was a time before militaria collecting was a thing, so there wasn't much of a market for built-tough, bulky military rifles. The best option to give these hunters what they wanted and to keep these former weapons manufacturers in business was to sporterize and sell the surplus rifles on the civilian market. That's where all these oddball captured rifles would come into play. The military would crack open their sealed warehouses and find these post-war gems 10 to 11 years later and turn them around for a bit of a profit. Here are a few examples of Czech, Austrian, and French sporterized rifles. Some of them are actually Carcanos. So what, you say? Eaton saw a market and wanted them. Why was this so weird? This might be hard for anyone born post-internet to think about, but cast your mind to a place when there wasn't such an interconnected globe. Globalization wasn't even a serious concept yet in 1929, and was heavily discouraged amongst the global powers of Europe. So Eaton saying they are going to be importing a foreign rifle to sell, when they themselves didn't stock any non-American rifles before this one, is very odd. I'll add another reason why this is weird. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Winchester was a huge firearms manufacturer. And by huge, I mean one of, if not the, largest firearms manufacturer in North America by the 1920s. Sure, you had Smith & Wesson and Colt and Remington and Savage, but it's hard to argue that those firearms companies captured more imaginations than Winchester. The very birth of the Western, an entire film genre, owes the Winchester rifle so much. To say every Canadian in the 1920s owned a Winchester is surely a lie, but I'll wager a good portion of hunters and homesteaders absolutely did. For example, the one you're looking at right now has been in one of our team members' families for 3 generations, and while in rough shape, still shoots true. Winchester was a big deal in Canada, but they weren't the only game in town. I listed off the other American firms, but there was a plucky little Canadian one that managed to work its product into the hearts, minds, and gun safes of the Canadian public. One that Eaton supposedly contracted to convert these Italian captures into ticking time bombs. Let me introduce Cooey. These were made by the H.W. Cooey Machine and Arms Company of Cobourg, Ontario. Herbert Cooey opened his first machine shop in November of 1903 in Toronto, on the corner of Queen and Spadina. He would pick up contracts for small engines and custom machines, but would strike gold during World War I. His contract for the Ross Rifle site made him fairly wealthy, and in 1919 he decided, hey, that gun stuff was kind of fun. I like to shoot. Why don't we make rifles here? And so the .22 Cooey Canuck was born. It was an instant hit in eastern Canada, supposedly selling 6,000 rifles by 1922. However, Herbert wasn't done. He wanted a rifle in every single Canadian home, 2 if possible. His Canuck was so cheap and easy to produce, he could charge a bargain price for what he saw as an excellent rifle. And he wasn't wrong about the shooting quality. Herbert himself went to the 1924 Paris Olympics, even supplying the shooters with all Cooey guns. And they would win a silver for the team trap shooting event. The notoriety and proximity to Eaton's head office caught the eye of the company, and by 1929, Cooey was being asked to make rifles for their in-house Eatonia brand. Now that the business partnership had been formed, someone at Eaton's popped the question to Cooey, have you ever sporterized anything? And that's how we get to this odd hodgepodge of a gun. A Canadian-converted, Greek-calibered, Italian-made, Austrian-captured Eaton 6.5mm bolt-action, high-powered rifle. I must admit, the rifles do look pretty good. Cooey did a great job sporterizing them. Actually, I've tricked you. These were all sporterized in Austria. But they look awfully similar, don't they? Perhaps the markings on my rifle will distinguish it as an Eaton's or Cooey creation. Well, there are no markings to speak of. All it says is 6.5 on the top of the breech, and that's it. So how about the advertisements? Eaton's wasn't shy about their or Cooey's branding. In fact, they used to proudly state it. None of the ads I could find for these rifles contained any mention of them being from Cooey or part of the Eatonia branding. In fact, a surplus store in 1934 would put the Eaton 6.5mm rifle above their selection of Cooey's. It's almost as if Cooey had very little to do with this rifle. So what's going on here? Well, this is where the rabbit hole of research started. We painstakingly went over lawsuits, Eaton's catalogs, shooting articles, BBS firearms forums, and even modern-day Facebook Cooey groups. And no one could tell us exactly what made this rifle a Cooey, or point to a piece of litigation that proved it was dangerous. So, if it isn't a Cooey and it's not an Eatonia, then what is this? Well, follow along with us as we break down some of the design choices of this rifle and use those choices to find its true lineage. So to make heads or tails of the choices that makes this rifle itself, here is the best we can do based on our research. 6.5 by 54 Mannlicher Schonauer is a weird choice for a round, at least by today's standards. Yes, it was the main military caliber of Greece, but it was also the choice hunting cartridge for a famous big game hunter going by the name of Walter Karamoja Bell. If you've seen the film The Ghost in the Darkness, you'll know immediately why he was hired to protect the British in Uganda. When he wasn't stopping man-eating lions in East Africa, he was gold panning in the Yukon, and thanks to his experience in Africa, he would join up with the Canadian Mounted Rifles and fight in the Second Boer War, and his love for the 6.5mm round for big game would start to gain traction in the country. An article in 1929, the very first year the Eaton's Carcano was on sale, extolled the virtue of the 6.5 by 54 for trappers and hunters. And this is probably by design, as Eaton's would produce their own version of the 6.5 by 54 Mannlicher Schonauer. For the more firearms adept of you asking, why not just keep the rifle in 6.5 by 52 Carcano? That round was a state secret in the late 20s and early 30s, and wasn't going to be available in large quantities until after 1945. Nothing regarding Mussolini's military was going to leave Italy while he was in power, so the 6.5 by 54 was a nice, available compromise. It grew in popularity across Europe and finally made its way to North America thanks to places like Eaton's and people like Bell. One of the more standout features of an otherwise normal sporter job is this dual trigger set. Even the biggest layman knows that most guns have one trigger and that's it. In this case, it's to make up for the Carcano's long take-up and fairly mushy trigger, seen here. In less gun nut words, mass-produced military rifles are made tough, but not nice. The trigger in the back eliminates all that long take-up and gives the front trigger a nice clean break that you can adjust. It's also something that was seen on a lot of Austrian sporters from the Verlacht region in the south of the country. Verlacht was, and still is, a big manufacturer of firearms. So much so, it's on their coat of arms. I'm not sure Cooey had anything to do with the manufacture or the installation of this trigger set. I'm not gonna lie, this isn't the nicest sporter stock I've ever seen. You can clearly see where they added a second piece of wood to turn the military straight stock into a more pistol grip stock. It seems unique to the Canadian version, so maybe this is where Cooey's contribution was. Markings. What markings? No Eaton's, no Cooey, no Austrian sporter houses, nothing. In an ancient email, Richard Hobbs, the author of a long out-of-print Italian Carcano information book, says these rifles were taken by Austria and sporterized post-World War I. The double triggers were added and a "Made in Austria" was printed on the forend. Some of these were brought into Canada, where the barrels were changed out, supposedly. This is when the claims of them exploding because of poor construction start to crop up. It's probably where the lawsuit and recall slander starts, actually. Some crotchety old loser saw a set screw on the bottom of the rifle and said the barrel wouldn't be able to handle any pressure without even testing it. I can personally confirm that this rifle doesn't explode.
3, 2, 1...
But don't take my word for it. Many others have confirmed it too. And in case you think we didn't look up rifles exploding around the time this gun was in circulation, here are a bunch of articles on exploding rifles from 1929 to 1932. Most are negligent discharges, but they were reported on, which means if there was an Eaton's Carcano that exploded, someone would be on it. As a collector of historic guns for over 20 years, I can say without question that the Carcano gets the most unwarranted slander of all the period service rifles, aside from maybe the Ross, which is another rifle I've owned that I believe doesn't deserve its poor reputation. Where the Cooey Bible gets this lawsuit, explosion, and death blurb is really anyone's guess. John A. Belton was part of a niche community of firearms authors, so perhaps him and Mr. Hobbs spoke. I wish we had references in an appendix, or that I could personally speak to him, but unfortunately John passed away in 2018. It is possible that he was branching off of Herbert Cooey's xenophobia. Cooey was quoted in a number of articles stating that foreign rifles were cheap death traps, most likely to drive up sales of his own product. I can confirm the Carcano is a perfectly fine battle rifle, and Ian from Forgotten Weapons agrees with me.
And it is the rifle that Italy developed for World War II, and I will argue that it is conceptually one of the very best rifles, bolt-action rifles, of World War II.
Thanks, Ian, for letting me use that clip. I can also confirm that the Eaton's rifle is far from a death trap.
Dive in live! Empty. 6 rounds. Okay, the gun that doesn't work and is supposed to explode. The rifle that doesn't shoot. We got rounds in them. Let's see if it works. It works.
The extractor could use a bit more work, but that's hardly an explosion risk. So it isn't a death trap, that we can confirm. Now, can we at least confirm it was a Cooey? I'm gonna say Cooey had very little to do with this rifle. The source of their attachment is still unclear. Perhaps it was a big game of telephone where a salesman said it was a Cooey and then that perpetuated. Or maybe it was stored near the Cooey rifles and people picked up on that. Who really knows? The Eaton's Cooey Carcano turns out to be a bit of a misnomer. Yes, it's based on the World War I Carcano body, and yes, Eaton's imported them to be sold. Yeah, there are anecdotes of Cooey having a hand in sporterizing them, but who cares? The one definitive thing I can say is that they are safe, fun to shoot when they work, and they look pretty good hanging in a safe. Don't be afraid of them. Just go have fun with your bizarre rifle at the range. I appreciate you allowing me to brag about my really weird rifle and gush about the Cooey company. Despite the Olympic medals, a gold medal at the London Great Exhibitions of Work and Industry, moonlighting for Ivor Johnson Arms, and fostering Canadian shooting sports, the power of Winchester would forever haunt the Cooey company. Herbert retired in 1937 and his son Hubert took over. He would run the company successfully for 20 years until his untimely death in 1957. Herbert would come back to run Cooey, but he was far too old to keep up with the stress. He gave in and sold Cooey Machine and Arms to Olin Matheson, the parent company of Winchester. Cooey would be eventually rebranded to Winchester Canada and then fully closed in 1979. It was a huge loss for Canadian shooting sports, but don't fret, as Cooey's designs still live on. The Savage Model 64 is nearly a perfect copy. So why would Eaton's want this weird Carcano conversion? I'm still not sure, but let's employ a little bit of Occam's razor here. Cooey himself said how cheap, post-war European clones were ruining the domestic market. If that doesn't give more proof to Cooey not touching these things, it also might give proof that Eaton's just wanted to turn a profit and hop on a trend. For example, this is a cheap German 22 that has been in my family since World War II, and I can tell you they didn't buy it from Eaton's. So Eaton's, not wanting to miss a market with a possibly large profit margin, bought a bunch of 6.5mm rifles from, I don't know, Austria or Czechoslovakia for absolute pennies on the dollar. Then they had them rebarreled to an up-and-coming hunting cartridge that was fairly inexpensive to procure in bulk surplus from post-war Greece. That's the answer that satisfies my curiosity. I really do hope it does the same for yours. Thanks for watching.